Okay, welcome to our very first online science notes recording. Our very first set of notes is going to be, what is science? Now, this sounds like a pretty simple question to ask, but really the idea is we want to get an overall view, an idea of why we study this subject of science. Do we just have experiments and explosions and microscopes and animals and things, or is there really something deeper behind it? As I mentioned in the Juno pod prior to starting this video, these notes should have been in the plastic page protector that I gave you. Hopefully you received that at Meet the Teacher. If not, let me know and I can get you the notes. But this set of notes, what is science, as well as lab safety notes, are going to be located in that plastic page protector. So go ahead and take that out now and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. As you see here in number 1, it says write your first and last name on the upper right corner of your notes. There should be a spot there that says name. Go ahead and write your name there. Below that should be the title, what is science? And then you'll notice that we have 2 boxes here. In a previous video, I went through Cornell notes, what those are, and why we have a left margin and then a right-hand side where we take more detailed notes. If you haven't watched that yet, go ahead and go back to do that now. But if you have, number 2 says, on the first section of your notes, answer this question in 2 or more complete sentences. What is science? Now, I want you to go ahead and pause the video, take 2 minutes to maybe 5 minutes to answer that question in your own words. Maybe, for example, pretend that you were at lunch with a friend, or you come home at night to talk to your parents or your aunts or uncles, and they say, hey, so-and-so, what is science? And you have to give them an answer. Whatever you would say is what I want you to write down. So go ahead and hit pause and then fill that out. We'll come back in just a minute. Okay, normally I would pause here in class and then take some of your answers. I want to hear what some of your thoughts are as far as what science is. But hopefully you gave some kind of explanation of what you've experienced in science, whether it's studying an insect or reading a book about science or taking a telescope and looking into space, okay? But we're going to go ahead and give science a definition here in our notes. So as you'll see in your notes, I have blanks for you to fill in. On the slides, they will be underlined. So here it says, science is a pursuit of knowledge about the world in which we live. The universe displays order and patterns that are comprehensive through careful, systematic study. And really, it's just the best way we have of finding out about the world and everything in it. Sorry, I clicked forward a little too fast there. But the idea here, let me get my little pen so I can draw on the screen. All right, cool. So science is a pursuit of knowledge about the world in which we live. The main point of science is for us to be able to have a question and answer it in some way, okay? Maybe you walk outside and think, man, where does all of this air come from? Okay, science would be that asking that question and in the process of discovering the answer. Or maybe you think, when I set this cold can of soda outside on a hot day, all of a sudden it begins to drip water. Okay, but there's no water in the can. It's Coke or it's Sprite in the can. So how does water get to be on the outside of the can without me actually opening it? Okay, that would be a question that you have, and the pursuit of that answer, figuring out why that happens or proving why that happens, that is science. Okay, so our class of science is just giving you more background information to either answer the questions that you may have or even form more questions about things that you already know. Secondly, it's important to note that the universe displays order and patterns that we can understand through careful, systematic study. This is very interesting. I say a lot of times that science and math pretty much go hand in hand. Science is systematic. There's a process that we go through to study science, and it's important to make sure you follow those steps in order. Just like in math, you don't want to do things out of order or you'll get the wrong answer. Science is very organized, and you'll see that through our notes, through charts and graphic organizers that we'll do in class, through diagrams and things like that. It has a very systematic process that keeps it orderly and much easier to understand. And lastly, it's the best way we have of finding out about the world and everything in it. It is, like I said, it is the process of asking the questions and then seeking to find the answers in a systematic way. Trying to move forward and it will not let me. Maybe I have to come here first. Okay. Let me erase these here. Maybe I won't draw on every single slide if it's going to do that. That would be kind of annoying. Okay. Science is dynamic, building upon the ideas and inventions or discoveries of previous generations. One of the best examples of this is when I was in school, there were 9 planets orbiting the sun, including the planet Pluto being the furthest out from the sun. Now we know that through further discovery and more systematic kind of charting of that planet in its orbit, we now know that Pluto is not actually a planet. We consider it a dwarf star. So it is no longer considered as part of the planet solar system. So we now say that there are 8 planets orbiting the sun and 1 dwarf planet. Okay. So this is actually very interesting. Even in my classroom, I have a periodic table of the elements hanging up in the back of the room. And even that table is updated throughout the years, right? As more elements are discovered, as more atomic mass of the individual elements is discovered, we're constantly having to update science because we're constantly learning more and more about it. Okay. Just like even with the pandemic, right? Once we learn more about the coronavirus and how it acts and how we can hopefully prevent it one day, science will continue to develop and change. It's not a static thing that, like, for example, in history, you can go back and say, okay, well, this happened during World War I. Yes, that's true. We can't go back and change that. Science, however, is constantly building upon the ideas and discoveries of previous generations. We're constantly changing it as we make new discoveries. And then secondly, science makes huge leaps forward when new discoveries are made. Oftentimes, the discovery of something scientific or the invention of a new scientific tool will then explode into all this further discovery, leaving more and more to be discovered and written about. So science is never boring. It is constantly advancing and moving forward. Okay. A good example of this is in this article here. I'm not sure how this will work, if it will. Oh, perfect. It will bring it up. Okay. So I like to bring this up because oftentimes science is something that we maybe don't do intentionally. It just happens naturally. So these are 10 of the greatest accidental inventions of all time. I'm not going to go through all 10 just for sake of time, but I am going to show you a few of my favorites. Okay. For example, the microwave, discovered by Percy L. Spencer. Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon after his World War I stint in the Navy, was known as an electronics genius. In 1945, Spencer was fiddling with a microwave-emitting magnetron, which is used in the guts of radar arrays, when he felt a strange sensation in the pocket of his pants. A sizzling, even. Spencer paused and found that a chocolate bar he had in his pocket had started to melt. Figuring that the microwave radiation of the magnetron was to blame, or to credit, as it would turn out, Spencer immediately set out to realize the culinary potential at work, basically the potential for it to be used in the kitchen. The end result was the microwave oven, savior of eager snackers and single dudes worldwide. Okay, so this man here, Percy L. Spencer, was not trying to invent this box that would quickly heat up food, but through a different experiment, a different invention he was trying to make, he noticed that, hold on a second, this chocolate bar in my pants is beginning to get like melted almost, like it's maybe even hot. The only thing he could think of was that it had to do with that magnetron he had been playing around with. Lo and behold, after further study and experiments, he invented the microwave. Okay. Next one, Sweet and Low, a 0-calorie sweetener. In 1879, Ira Rempson and Konstantin Fallberg, who were at work in a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, paused to eat. Fallberg had neglected to wash his hands before the meal. So he'd been playing around with chemicals and things in the lab, forgot to wash his hands, which usually leads to a quick death for most chemists. But in this case, it led him to noticing an oddly sweet flavor during his meal. Turned out to be artificial sweetener. Okay. Now that's crazy because typically you don't just want to be eating random chemicals, right? Well, this guy got extremely lucky, and this particular chemical combination turned out to be what would later become the invention of 0-calorie sweetener. Thankfully, it wasn't something that killed him. Okay. I'm going to do two more here. Play-Doh, which was invented by Kutal Products. Before being found ground into the rugs of child-rearing homes everywhere, Play-Doh was ironically created to be a cleaning product. This paste was first marketed as a treatment for filthy wallpaper, before the company that produced it began to go down the tubes. However, the discovery that saved Kutal Products, which was headed for bankruptcy, wasn't that their wall cleaner worked particularly well, but that school children were beginning to use it to create Christmas ornaments as arts and crafts projects. By removing the compound's cleanser and adding colors and a fresh scent, Kutal spun their wallpaper saver into one of the most iconic toys of all time and brought mega success to a company that was headed for destruction. Sometimes you don't even know how brilliant you are until someone notices for you. Okay, so in this case, Kutal Products had invented this paste, almost like a sticky clay type substance, in order to clean wallpaper. But it wasn't selling very, very well. They realized, I guess people don't really want to clean their wallpaper, or they have better ways of doing it. However, they did notice that children everywhere were using their quote unquote cleaning product as a toy. They were using it to mold and create arts and crafts and then drying them out so that they would stay, using them as creating Christmas ornaments, etc. So they said, okay, well, instead of declaring bankruptcy, let's just change the purpose of our product from a cleaning product to a toy, and therefore invented Play-Doh. The last one I want to show you is super glue. And this is actually very interesting because the man who invented this, Harry Coover, as it says here, he was actually extremely frustrated with this goop until he discovered how helpful it could be. In what would have been a very messy moment of discovery in 1942, Dr. Harry Coover of Eastman Kodak Laboratories found that a substance he had created, cyanoacrylate, was a miserable failure. It was not, to his dismay, at all suited for a new precision gun sight, as he had hoped. But it infuriatingly stuck to everything that it touched. So it was forgotten. 6 years later, while overseeing an experimental new design for airplane canopies, Coover found himself stuck in the same gooey mess with a familiar foe. Cyanoacrylate was proving useless as ever, but this time Coover observed that the stuff formed an incredibly strong bond without needing any heat. Coover and his team tinkered with sticking various objects in their lab together and realized they had finally stumbled upon a use for this maddening goop. Coover slapped a patent on his discovery, and in 1958, a full 16 years after he first got stuck, cyanoacrylate was being sold on shelves. Okay, so at first he was super frustrated. He was trying to create a gun sight that you could use to, zoom in and be able to shoot guns more accurately, etc. But instead, it was just this sticky stuff that stuck to everything, and it would never come off. Later on, he had a need for something that would stick things together and never come off, and therefore he invented crazy glue or super glue. So those are just a few examples of inventions that were an accident, but ended up being extremely helpful later on. So in your notes, it says write 3 inventions with the names of their inventors from the web links we looked at in class. If I were you, I'd probably go back. I would rewind this video and go back to that article as I read through it. All you need to do is write the invention and then the name of the inventor next to it. Okay, so why do we study science? Well, for one thing, it's scientific knowledge for its own sake. It is good for you to understand how the world works in some way or shape or form. Now, you're never going to understand every single piece of it. I'm never going to ask you to know everything, but it is good for you to have an understanding of how weather works and how maps work and how things are put together and how animals function, how your body functions, how to take care of it, etc. It also pursues excellence and is part of the rigor in a classical education. It's not easy to understand all of science, but it is good for you to learn how to memorize these things. And also, it is part of history. It is a human endeavor with intriguing narratives. Okay, these pages here, normally I would probably project them on the board in class, but we do have these books called Science Saurus books that we'll use every now and then. But for now, I'm just going to quickly go through these gentlemen that you see pictured below, and I'll explain to you a little bit about what they did. The first man here, Isaac Newton, we're actually going to read a biography on him later on in the fall, but he was the man who first, he didn't invent gravity, but he first kind of noticed it and began to experiment with it and give it its name. He also invented calculus, as well as the different laws and theorems within science and mathematics as well. He lived around the same time as this gentleman here. This is Galileo Galilei. He invented the telescope. He also was one of the first to attempt to prove that the sun was the center of the solar system instead of the earth. We'll also read a biography on him later in the fall. He was a little bit of a rebel at the time and got in a little bit of trouble for the works that he did, but he was still an incredibly important scientist. The next gentleman here, George Washington Carver. He was one of the more famous African-American scientists and inventors. I believe he grew up as a slave, actually, but once slavery was abolished after the Civil War, which we'll also talk about in history, by the way, this man right here became very important, especially in the agriculture industry. He came up with many uses for growing sweet potatoes as well as peanuts. And then this man right here will also study a little bit into the fall in our classification unit, Carolus Linnaeus. He is known as the father of classification. He did a lot of study, especially on plants. Botany was kind of his thing. He really loved that. But he developed a system for organizing all of the living things, which, like I said, we'll look at in the fall as well. Okay. Other reasons to study science is it develops a healthy skepticism, which means evaluating claims based on evidence. Now, a good example of this would be if I were to just tell you, you know what, guys, I own 5 Ferraris. 5 Ferraris. And a skeptic is someone who would say, Miss Worsling, I doubt that. I've seen the car that you drive. It is not a Ferrari. Also, I know that you're a teacher, and nothing about you says that you have a ton of money, especially not enough to say that you own 5 Ferraris. That would be a wise observation of you, because based on the evidence, right, the fact that I drive a different car, the fact that I don't walk around in super fancy clothes or anything like that, those would be evidence that I probably don't have the money to afford 5 Ferraris. Okay, that would be a skeptic, someone who doubts or thinks, hold on, let me look at the facts before I agree with you on that. That's a very important part of science. People will tell you all the time, oh, did you know that this is a thing? Or did you know that this happens or this happens? You're a true skeptic, someone who truly loves science, will say, where's the evidence? Where is the proof? Let me evaluate that on my own before I just believe you because you said it. It also develops reading and writing skills. Obviously, science requires a lot of reading, but it also requires a lot of writing, as you see in this picture on the right here of this lab technician or scientist lady writing down and probably journaling in her lab worksheet there what she's been doing, keeping track of her experiments and the results of them. Also, there is something to be said for upholding virtue in science, being ethical in using and applying it. Being ethical basically means not using your knowledge for evil, but using it for good. Okay, a good example of this would be something like animal abuse or using your knowledge of how to help the environment to make the environment better and cleaner for society as well as for animals and humans living in it. So, lastly, I want to talk about our goals for science this year. First of all, we want to have an accurate understanding of different models, theories, and laws. Okay, we will go over the laws of gravity. We'll go through some of the laws of physics as well, the law of the pendulum. We'll also talk about laws of classification and living things as well. We want to be able to understand models, such as this picture of the water cycle here, and how those processes take place. We want to be able to explain this picture and what's happening here. Secondly, we want to have an accurate understanding of different processes in science. For example, this is the CO2-O2 cycle here, carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle. Has to do with decomposition and then cellular respiration, photosynthesis, all of those things. These all sound like very big words. Some of them you are probably familiar with or you've heard of them before, but we're going to study them a little more in depth this year in science. We also want to develop a deep appreciation of science. I cannot tell you how many times we'll look at something and you'll say, wow, that is so cool. And that is certainly something we want to encourage. And lastly, we want to continue developing clear and concise writing. In science especially, one of the big things is you have to be extremely clear and extremely concise and honestly very precise as well. The reason why I have this picture of physical quantities as well as units here, one of the rules in science is you never want to write a number by itself. You always want to have the unit with it. So, for example, if I said, oh, I have 6, you would say, Ms. Dorsling, what do you mean you have 6? You have 6 dogs, you have 6 apples, you have 6 pounds, you have 6 degrees. What kind of 6 are we discussing here? You always want to have a unit with that number, otherwise that number can get lost. So we always want to make sure we're labeling things. We want to conduct careful investigations and dissections, which is a lab technique. Here's where I tell you that yes, we will be doing a dissection this year. No, I am not going to tell you what it is, what we're going to dissect. If you have had students, if you have siblings that were students of mine in the past, you may have an idea, but don't ruin it for everyone else. Either way, it's a very fun lab, and you do get to experiment with the tools and dissection devices that you'll use in upper grades as well, more often than you would in 5th grade. In 5th grade, we don't do our dissection till the spring, towards the end of the year. But in the upper grades, you need to be a little more familiar with those. And then lastly, we want to make reasonable calculations with correct units. If I ask you to tell me how much mass is in your pencil, you're probably not going to say 12,000 grams. Okay, that would be something similar to like, I don't know, 12 pounds maybe or something like that. Hopefully you don't have a pencil that has that much mass that it is that heavy. Otherwise you have some very strong hands. Okay, as I also mentioned in the Cornell Notes video about the summary and the purpose of having a summary section, here we're going to go ahead and write a summary, a 3 to 5 sentence summary about what you now know science is all about. This does not have to be super in-depth, nor does it have to be incredibly well-crafted. But I did give you an example here, which is just very basic. Please don't copy this word for word, but I did want to give you an example. If you can't quite get to 3 to 5 sentences, just stick with 3 well-crafted sentences. Do not tell me science is cool. Science is fun. Okay, these kinds of sentences are not going to fly in fifth grade. But go back through your notes and take different details and different pieces of what I've just taught you here and give me a good summary of what science is about. I do want you to go ahead and write that in the summary section of your notes. And then in the following slides of the JunoPod, you'll see the assignment for this summary section.